Call the November 15th, 2022 work session, electric board order. First agenda item is the agenda check. Does anybody have any issues with the agenda? Any recommendations? Then we'll jump right into goal number 5, IRP planning, reference modeling, and Megan Capper is going to take us through a nice discussion.
Thank you so much. Good evening, commissioners. So I'm Megan Capper, Energy Resources Manager, and I'm here with Ben Ulrich. He's pretty much the architect, been the architect of the Integrated Resource Plan. And then we have John Kreider at the table with us, who's been driving the models. First of all, just thank you so much for dedicating tonight to discuss the Integrated Resource Plan. As you will recall, this is the first IRP in many years, and we're focusing on creating a foundation from which to develop the tools and internal skills to make important future resource decisions. So tonight is when we're going to take the information presented to date, the customer load characteristics and shapes, and the resource options and their characteristics, and we're going to put them together and see where the gaps exist, what resource options are chosen, and at what cost, given specific criteria. We're calling this the calculated reference case. This reference case represents the calculated results from an initial set of assumptions. It serves as a comparison case for our work in early 2023, when we will plan to vary the key input assumptions to see how sensitive the results are to changes. The plan this evening is to for you to get to really know and understand these results, their inputs and their assumptions. We will also like to spend some time to discuss your thoughts on what assumptions you would like to see varied and the impacts on those assumptions on the results. So let's look at the first timeline. In a couple weeks at the December board meeting, we're going to be back in front of you with the public draft IRP to discuss our public engagement plan and next steps. And then let's take a quick moment look at early 2023. There we go. We have a February town hall that we're planning to engage the public. And then we'll be back in the March board meeting to share interim results from the future exploration of the calculated reference case and to seek direction from the board around action items and next steps. The final IRP will be published in June. And then shortly thereafter, staff are going to begin building off of this foundational IRP, updating assumptions and preparing for our 2024 IRP. So I will hand it off to John Kreider.
Thanks, Megan. Good evening, commissioners. My name is John Kreider. As Megan has said, I'm an analyst in the planning section, along with Ben and Aaron Bush. My job in the section is to run the Aurora simulator, keep it maintained, and make sure it produces the type of results we're looking for, and produces the modeling results that we're going to see tonight. I'd like to talk to you tonight about the modeling process and some of the assumptions that go into the work, and give you some context so that you'll be able to understand better how this calculated reference case modeling result is actually used. So where does this reference case come from that we're talking about? Power planning uses a software called Aurora that simulates the hourly operation of both the EWEB system and the WEC-wide system. And that latter part allows us to simulate interacting with the market. So there's lots of variables that go into the simulation. The last study I looked at had something like 1.3 million variables in it. We have to make some assumptions about some of them, not all of them, but some of them. So tonight we're going to talk about some of those key assumptions that we have that go into the model because they really drive the model results. And one of the things we want to be talking about is how much some of these assumptions might drive the results, move the needle on those results. Some are going to be more important than others. So we picked out a couple that we think are really key to look at. So we take these assumptions and we put them, how do we get the calculated reference case? We basically take our assumptions on cost, demand, constraints, and availability of resources. We put them into the Aurora machine and essentially we turn the crank and the Aurora gives us something in 3 days. We're calling that the calculated, it's a calculated optimal portfolio, which in this case we're calling the calculated reference case. So let's talk about what the calculated reference case is not first. So it's not a recommendation for doing anything. It's not a recommendation for procuring resources, even though it is a list of resources. It's a portfolio that is going to meet the demand that we put in as an assumption cost on optimal cost basis. It's not been evaluated for anything other than those assumptions. So it might not have as good a performance or cost profile as it does under the assumptions that we put in. So we're going to be testing those assumptions over the course of a few months and a few years, actually, to see. The calculated reference case is, however, a computed portfolio of resources. It's going to meet the assumed demand. It's the direct output of all results, and they're chosen basically on cost. So it becomes a starting benchmark for us to use this as a comparison against other types of sensitivities that we may run, or other portfolios that you might want us to run, or that we might decide and see what they look like. So next, let's go back to the beginning of that and talk about some of those assumptions that go into the award. So the reason that we're going to be talking about the assumptions, this is probably the key takeaway on the subject, is that these are assumptions that staff and management have decided on as reasonable, and they're solidly supported by data, but of course they're subject to better understanding as we get more information and we run more analysis. So we do expect that this new information is going to go into the modeling, and we'll be able to optimize that portfolio. This is a good starting place for us based on the assumptions that we do know about and the information that we do have at hand. So as a general philosophy, it's been our intention to choose assumed values when we have to that reflect generally a median or an average approach, an expected view of the world. For example, if a resource has a cost that has a range from a minimum to a maximum, our tendency, if there's no other compelling reasons, to pick something in the middle. So you can think of all of these assumptions, and the reference case is sort of a median or average. Our idea in the sense was business as usual. What would be an expected kind of reference case? I'm going to talk now about some of these key assumptions in more detail and why we're interested in them. So transmission is the first one on the list here. In our model, we've assumed that there's existing transmission available to us for these resources, and that they are priced at the at the prices that are currently being charged. We've also included some reasonable cost estimates and we've included some reasonable cost estimates for existing transmission tariffs, but we've also are interested in this one area of transmission because there's a lot of uncertainty in when new transmission is going to be built and how much it's going to cost and how much it will, when it may be available and how much it may cost. So transmission in this case is especially important because as you'll see when Ben starts to go through the portfolio slides, there's a lot of material reliance on Wyoming and Oregon, Northeast Oregon wind resources and Wyoming resources. As time progresses, we'll be able to better understand the true availability and the cost of the transmission as we get better information, and we may adjust our analysis. So in demand, the calculated reference case portfolio uses the base case for demand that was in the electrification study that you all have seen. And this also assumes unmanaged EV charging that adds to our system fees. So I point out that the forecast really starts to uptick in demand starting about 2032, this demand assumption. Because we've chosen the medium load case as the demand assumption, it also means that there's a possibility of that being higher or lower. If that's the case, it's going to stress our portfolio in different ways. So that's another sensitivity we would like to look at staff. As that demand changes, how much does it change what we reference portfolio? The third assumption we're talking about tonight is called a planning standard. The planning standard is essentially a measure of how much reserve generation we're going to include in our portfolio so that we avoid going to market in those times that we need to have energy. So our reference case chooses to meet the highest load hour each year, and this is known as a 1 and 2 planning standard. That means that we will meet that peak load half the time. That's a 50-50 1-2 planning standard. But that also means that we have zero reserve or no extra cushion before going to market. We have an energy. The extra capacity cushion that we're talking about is usually expressed as a percentage of peak capacity, for instance, 15%. That would mean that we're building our portfolio. Inside that portfolio is going to be 15% of capacity that we're sort of holding back in reserve. And that's why it's called a margin. That's the PRM, planning reserve margin. And so think of that as extra capacity. And so if we do build to a higher than 1 and 2 standard, we're going to be expanding that portfolio. And then finally, the fourth key assumption we look at is water. As you're going to see from Ben's slides, the reference portfolio puts a lot of the weight on the Northwest Hydro system. In the study, just as in today, most of the load is assumed to be filled by BPA, which we know is all hydro, or almost all hydro. And that means our portfolio performance and costs are also going to be dependent on the water. Our assumption for the reference case is, again, as in the case of other assumptions, kind of a typical middle of the road water year. What we want to do is be able to stress the results on different water years. And this is part of our planned risk analysis. So we can see as we change the water years from bad water year to better water year, how that changes what resources may make up the pool. So I know I went through this pretty fast, and we had a lot of input assumptions in this model. We attempted to identify the most important ones in your memo. But I want you to keep these assumptions in mind as we review the calculated reference case portfolio next. And Ben is going to go through those slides.
Sean. So before we talk about what resources might be part of our best fit portfolio in the future, I thought it'd be good to kind of recap where our portfolio is at today. So the chart on the right shows our nameplate capacity of our current portfolio, which is the maximum amount of generation that our current portfolio could hypothetically produce. However, we know that actual energy production is always much less than your nameplate generator, or is always less than your nameplate generator, because there's some type of operating constraint. So like for hydro, we're concerned about the water year. You can't always produce at max at all hours. So system planners, we're concerned about the nameplate capacity of our generators, but also their ability to help us meet our system peaks. So I'm going to provide some context here to this portfolio by overlaying some of the things we've talked about this year. So recall that EWEB's average annual load is about 275 average megawatts. And back in April, we discussed that our typical system peak is about 465 megawatts. So that's a 1 and 2 type event. This represents the highest hour of load that we would expect in that typical year. And for each of these resources, our team calculated peak capacity values based on historical performance of the resource. And wherever possible, we informed our assumptions based on the Western Resource Adequacy Program, which is still under development. Using this methodology, we were able to calculate an initial peak capacity value for our portfolio of 509 megawatts. And you'll see that it's actually higher than our single hour peak today. This implies that we have an initial reserve margin today of 9%. But as John stated earlier, our planning standard right now that we're using in the reference case is just a 1 and 2 event. We're not planning for extra cushion or an additional planning reserve margin. That's an assumption we can test, as the Western Resource Adequacy Program might require us to carry additional reserves in the future. So it's something we can look into as part of the sensitivity analysis. So now that we've kind of covered where we're at today, I can show you how that resource mix is expected to change over time. We'll start with our starting point here on the left. You'll see that peak capacity of 509 megawatts today in 2022, and the various resources that contribute to that peak capacity. And you'll note that our hydro portfolio really doesn't change over the study period. This is one of the first key takeaways from our reference case, that continuing BPA block and slice is one of EWEB's least cost portfolio options. We know that there's still more analysis to do on future BPA product choices, so we plan to do a deeper dive on that as part of our 2024 IRP. The other key finding you can see on this slide is that 2026 is the first time that the modeling results show new resource additions. Our existing thermal contracts for IP and Seneca are assumed to expire in 2025. And in 2026, the model begins to select new resources to meet our peak capacity needs, which are shown in that dotted line. So now we can talk about those best fit resources that the modeling selected. The model primarily selected 4-hour lithium ion batteries, which are shown in teal, wind, which is in light green, demand response in purple, and conservation in black. Batteries are one of the least cost resources for capacity and offer flexibility to move energy around on a daily basis. This means that batteries can often have opportunities to charge during off-peak and discharge during the peak to either reduce system costs or generate revenue. This ability to generate revenue can lower the net carrying cost of ownership and make batteries an appealing resource to meet our capacity needs. There are also large amounts of new wind that were selected by the model. Wind has a low cost of energy, but also provides some winter peaking capacity. So as the model looked for resources that produce low cost, carbon-free energy, it likely favored wind's ability to help meet our winter system peaks. The model selected some, but not all, of the demand response programs that it was offered. The model primarily selected residential programs, which are assumed to have lower implementation costs. These programs include time of use rates, critical peak pricing, and space and water direct load control programs like smart thermostats. The model also did select a very small amount of commercial and industrial curtailment programs, less than 1 megawatt. Further study through demand response potential assessment could help us better understand these costs and energy profiles of potential demand response programs in the future. The model also selected affordable conservation programs that had a levelized cost below $15 per megawatt hour. The model was selecting approximately 1 megawatt of peak conservation each year, which is roughly half the amount of conservation that EWEB's programs currently target today. As you can see, the model continues to add that same mix of batteries, wind, demand response, and conservation throughout the study period until that very last year. You can see that tiny sliver of red in 2042 where the model selects a small modular nuclear reactor. Small modular reactors do benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act, so that may be a contributing factor here. But we found it interesting that the model broke from the pattern of selecting new wind and batteries and instead chose a clean dispatchable resource in this final year of the study. It implies that there's likely a role for dispatchable resources as part of EWEB's future portfolio. So as we do future sensitivity analysis, we'll want to see how often dispatchable resources are considered part of our least cost portfolio mix. This last chart switches from megawatts and we switch over to dollars. It shows the estimated costs in thousands of dollars for the reference case portfolio. Overall, our modeling results show that EWEB's portfolio would grow at an average annual rate of 4%. However, this includes the impacts of a 2.5% assumed inflation rate, and it also shows that our peak load is expected to grow at 2% per year as a result of electrification. One caveat I'll share about this chart is that it does not include the future spending costs for Lieberg. This only assumes that Lieberg returns to service and is assuming just historical cost of operations, historical generation. We plan to update this assumption based on as the board makes decisions about Lieberg using the triple bottom line framework. Overall, these reference case results imply that future resource costs may remain relatively flat to where they are compared today after you adjust for inflation and energy growth. However, supply chain issues around batteries and the need for transmission expansion are two key risks that we want to consider when we look at these results. An additional thing I'd like to call out on this chart is this portfolio's relationship with the market. It does occasionally import energy, which is shown in the market purchases, which is orange at the top of the bars, but primarily similar to our portfolio today, this reference case is long on average because it meets most of our peak needs with hydro and renewable resources. And these resources are dispatched by the weather, and they'll produce energy even when you don't necessarily need it. It's not bad to be long on average. In fact, it can be a great way to reduce your total portfolio cost by selling that surplus energy into the market. But we know that this exposes EWEB to the risk of falling energy prices. So as we look to do our sensitivity results and do risk analysis, we plan to bring back more insights into this in the coming months. So as we mentioned, we know that we have some analysis that the board will want to see. These individual sensitivities listed here could be combined together to create scenarios and generate new portfolios that we could then compare to the reference case. For example, there was a pre-meeting question about climate change scenarios, and we could combine multiple assumptions together to make that scenario and look at the results. We plan to do some work around that hydro and natural gas risk analysis to understand how volatility can impact the portfolio. We plan to analyze transmission risk and look at how increasing the assumed cost of transmission might impact the model selecting different resources. We've also heard the board's curiosity about load growth, low or high load growth scenarios. In addition to that, we discussed a planning reserve margin potential from the Western Resource Adequacy Program that might be imposed on EWEB in the future. As Megan mentioned in the timeline slides at the beginning of the presentation, we'll be doing a formal public outreach in the next few months. We plan to listen to the board and public feedback to generate additional areas for sensitivity analysis. So with that, we can open it up for the board discussion and feedback. We're curious your thoughts about the reference case results and some of the next steps that we proposed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. We just took a drink out of a fire hydrant. We can capture some of our questions and comments, so I'll open up the queue.
I'll start. I've got quite a few questions. Some of them are broad and some of them are focused. So on the Seneca and the IP contracts going away in 2025, is Seneca carbon free or is that it's not carbon free? Can you tell me the definition of how that is? It's renewable, but not carbon.
It's considered renewable by the state standards, so it does generate renewable energy credits.
Okay.
However, it does have some carbon content because it is a combusted process.
Okay. And was there a reason why we didn't continue that into the model past 2025?
Model did have the option to select a new biomass facility. I would characterize that facility as an affordable biomass facility. It did not choose to do it in the reference case run. So it chose to build batteries and wind instead of that option.
Okay. So then that batteries are a good transition into my second question. So when we're talking about batteries, is that something that is local or is that a contracted thing? I mean, do we build the batteries and have them sitting out in our back lot here, or is that something that somebody else builds the batteries and then transmission is the
We did not assume any transmission build costs for the batteries. So either the batteries are assumed to be sited either next to a renewable generator or would be sited locally. So there wouldn't be any marginal cost of transmission. So that's kind of how we treated it in the model.
Okay. And then did the model take into effect so if we've got batteries that can store 4 hours worth of it, 10 megawatts is that, or 100 megawatts, right?
Any megawatt, right. Yeah.
So on not a peak time, we could use that as a income, right? Because we can fill it up and then sell it off on a daily market. And was that put into it and that's how it brought the cost down, or is that it is? Okay.
Yes.
And then I guess there's two other ones. I'll do one more and then I'll do a second round on the second one because it's an easier one. The Western Regional Planning thing and our need for PRM. What do you think the scenario of that is and how much is that? I mean, are they saying we're going to have 10% more for them to use? That we have to contract and plan for 10 or 15% more energy than we need because Montana might need it if we join this thing? Can somebody explain this to us?
I'll defer that one to you.
Okay. So the idea of the resource what's called the RAP, Western Resource Adequacy Program, is that if you were to, as an individual utility, go through the process, you would say that to hedge my bets in this, I need 10%, or whatever you picked as your safety margin. The goal of the program is for people to have a lesser amount and share it. So it may not be 10%, it might be 5%, I don't know what it's going to be, but it's enough that you can share across and leverage across the region. Now, we, as an individual utility, are not what's called a balancing authority, but we are part of Bonneville's balancing authority, and they would, whatever the program ends up being, they will impose on their utilities. So or they'll say, don't worry about it, but we will charge you for it. So if you need it, or if you violate your requirement, it would be a financial penalty. So, and we haven't baked those financial obligations into it because we don't know what those are yet. But it could be better to have a 5% or a 10% of your own than to pay for somebody else to do it for you. But we haven't made that comparison because we don't know that detail yet.
And now's the time for the crystal ball. How long and how practical is it to think that this RAP is going to happen?
It's going to happen one way or the other. So it will either happen as independent effort like it is now, or when you hear about organized markets developing, a resource adequacy requirement is always part of a market. So it's going to happen one way or the other. It's a matter of when does that become an obligation for EWEB? There's some discussions around the Bonneville contract and whether that would be part of the new contract that launches in 2025 to 2028. That's probably the expectation that we would see. But resource adequacy is a utility requirement in almost any future condition.
Okay, thanks.
Others, Sonia.
Okay, I have a couple of follow-up questions too. I'll jump in with those. So on the RAP that you were just talking about, on the excess requirement, how does that work for utilities that don't do any generation? They still have to have excess for variance, right? They can't just rely entirely on, Bonneville, let's say.
Right, their balancing authority would take care of that and they would charge their utilities accordingly.
Okay. Does Bonneville have more capacity if some of these other options don't go off? I mean, when I'm looking up there and I see, 2025, Seneca is dropping off. Do we have the ability to fill that in that quickly? That's only a couple of years away.
The initial, so I can answer that one of our core assumptions in this model was that we assumed that Bonneville would not be able to grow with us. That's just an assumption. It doesn't mean that Bonneville can't grow to meet our loads, but we wanted to kind of hold that as a fixed option so that we could see what other resources the model might start selecting to supplement Bonneville as our loads start to grow.
Okay, so its recommendation is kind of artificially held, so these other items come in. But it's not necessarily that it wouldn't recommend that we just went with Bonneville and that might be the least cost option. Okay. All right, what is the timeline for the IRP? For some reason, I was thinking it was a shorter timeline, but now we're looking at 20 years, and it was interesting to see the nuclear piece pop in there at the end. So what is
it's a long horizon.
Okay.
John, John formerly worked at the PUC, so he got to see everyone's IRPs, but I want to say that 20 years is the standard. Does that feel about right?
It does. Well, it's a 20-year lookout, and usually a utility has something like a 5-year action window trying to do things. But the advantage of taking the long look is sort of to get yourself ready, even though there's a lot of things that are unknown, say 15 years out. By the time you do the next one, they're only 10 years out. So you sort of narrow yourself down. So I think that's a reason to start with such a long point as you're trying to get down to that period, which is something on 5 to 10 years. And if transmission is involved, maybe it's a couple of years.
Okay, so that was part of my next question. So if it's 5 to 10 years, how are we filling that gap in 2 years?
Well, this is a calculated result, right? We fixed our assumptions, so we limited our Bonneville. We're assuming that just the contracts expire with IP and Seneca. So it goes back to the reference case, it's just a calculated result based on our assumptions. And so I don't want to.
Important to recognize though that the first resource that we need isn't until 2026. And so we have time. I mean, we're in 2022. The first time we actually need to go out and get a resource is 2026. And we're looking at this on a planning basis. And so we still are looking out and looking at the market. Is that something that we can do? What will happen is once we come back to you in March, we'll talk to you a little bit about what might be some of our next step action items. And that will be around maybe doing some research to help us prepare for that 2026 time period.
Because 2026 utility timeframes feel like it's tomorrow when, you're saying it's a 10 to 15 year.
And if there's a market that says, if we determine that there's a market out there, there's always an option. We believe there is.
I would point out that it's really common, Commissioner Carlson, when an organization goes through an IRP, they develop their action plan, and sometimes their action plan is to look at immediate actions in the next year or 2 or 3, as well as some of the longer term horizons. But it might be that it would be behoove us to continue a contract with one of these local resources, especially if we test, the sensitivities help us answer questions. And one of the examples is if we want to do determine the value of localness, we'll put in sensitivities around transmission. So how much is that transmission really at risk? How much is it going to cost? And so we can determine the value, for example, of a local resource and see if it gets selected at some level of transmission risk.
Okay, that kind of covers, well, it doesn't cover it, but that touches on 2 of the other topics, but I do see that I'm out of time, so and defer to others and I'll loop back around on those 2 specifically.
Cindy.
Thank you. So on the BPA topic, question about that. So what you're saying is you artificially assumed that we weren't going to buy any more from BPA, right? But in reality, because we're going to be making a decision, how do we know, is BPA developing energy sources? What is the state of?
I can ask that. Right now, we're starting a negotiation. And I think you've heard around the contract. I think you've heard Frank say in the past that, looking at the hydro all over the United States, hydro, whether it's climate change, whether it's fish and wildlife, or you start to see a decrease in it. So it really is an assumption that we are assuming that we probably won't be able to get any more Bonneville. What you have right now is you have all the utilities in the Northwest looking at a potential electrification load. And so as we go and we start the conversation with Bonneville about the contract, we have to look at what is the system size? And then how do we allocate that system? And then does Bonneville actually augment or not? Those discussions are all being talked about now. And it's, it would surprise me if we were to get a significant amount of other, I guess, allocation. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's also fair to recognize Bonneville is the marketing agency for the federal resources, which is mostly hydro, but also includes the nuclear station in Washington. They have an obligation to serve the utilities like EWEB in the Northwest. And if we were to decide that we needed more from Bonneville, then they would ask for a commitment from EWEB so that they could go out and procure additional resource to help fill that. So it's not totally off the table that we could do more with Bonneville. It would not be at the tier 1 price we get today. If they have to augment their system to support us, then that would cost something. And we can't model that right now because it's not defined yet from Bonneville. But there is more than, there's a number of options that we can look at relative to our relationship with Bonneville.
That's a good point. The tier 1 is what we get at cost. And so I was assuming you're saying we get more at cost. But there's this tier 2 that we're talking that is actually more it's at a market price.
Yeah, I have more questions, but just quickly about the Lieberg assumptions. In the model that we have starting now, do you have Lieberg operating at peak capacity even though we're not operating it? Is that within that assumption?
Yeah, so the assumes that Lieberg will just magically come back online, more costs, and just operate like it has historically. It was kind of it was starting in 2036, 2036. So we chose not to zoom in on Lieberg for the IRP. We're trying to kind of separate those conversations and draw some more thematic results.
Okay, I have more questions, but my time is up, so.
You know, if you want to keep going, go ahead. We're going to run another round. So if you're on a roll, if you got more written
I
down.
just have one other question then. It's about the climate change scenario. So you said that when we kind of take this out to the public or when you get feedback from us, you can tweak things. And I guess my question is about like a climate change scenario. Like, isn't that just climate now? Or, like, shouldn't that be, is that like our baseline assumption is that whatever we're predicting for climate change, like it's here now, there's no other.
Yeah, I attended some recent load forecasting and people are really struggling with, what data sets do I grab and what forecast do I assume going forward? So switching from history may not be the future. And so load forecasters are really struggling with how do I predict where the climate's going to head in my community. So I guess what I'd say is it's in an emerging field, and choosing data sets that you can say this is the trajectory. But I think that's a great example for sensitivity analysis.
Yeah, I would answer that by saying sort of. For example, on a lot of our history, utilities used to look back 50 years or 60 years, and now that dilutes the later trends when you talk about weather patterns and load and consumption. But we do need to test some things further. For example, hydro conditions were mentioned. We've prepared, our best crystal ball relative to hydro conditions, but we need to test that sensitivity. What if it's not what we think it is? How does that affect our portfolio? What are the risks that creates? Same with further electrification. If we see further load and electrification, then what happens under that type of scenario as well? So we moderately continued trends that we're seeing today, but we also need to test under a more extreme condition what new challenges and what new choices does that create. And so that's kind of what we meant by I would say a greater sensitivity around climate issues.
What do you want me to? Go ahead. I just have a few general ones, and I'm sorry to be so generic, but so the 509 peak happened, 5 years ago?
550, yeah, 2050.
So what happens during this modeling period if we have that peak changes? If we have a period of a week of below zero with wind and our peak goes from 509 to 550, what happens to this model?
I can tell you, I can talk a little bit about that. So this model really is looking out over the into the future over a long period of time. And so it really is just a planning model. And when we come into operations, what we do right now is we have what we call a summer readiness and a winter readiness. And so a couple months before, what are we in right now? November. So the traders and staff and analysts are looking at what does it look like? What are the hydro? What is our forecast of our generation? What's the forecast looking for our load? And and they can say, you know what, it looks like we want to be able to be prepared. And so we'll hold an X amount of generation out. So operationally, it is different than planning in order to prepare. And then as the information we get closer and closer to any kind of an event, then we can tweak it and they can buy and sell depending on the new information they have. Does that help?
Yeah, look, I'm just
I can-
concerned about having, not being able to serve our customers. Right now, the best we can do is 509, and that's the peak we've had in the history. But if it goes to 550, are we going to have a shortfall of 41 megawatts and not be able to serve our customers?
Yeah, we would, if we came into a situation, because we could go out and we can buy, like a month or two ahead of time, and even go a little bit longer, in addition to our generating resources. And if we get into that situation, then we would be out on the market buying at a high, and probably what I would consider a very high price, because if our load's that high, I'm sure others in the Northwest are.
President Brown, typically going into a season, it's about your planning horizon, and Megan's correct. This is a long-term planning horizon. When we get into our seasonal horizons, we tend to look at a 1 in 10 event, for example. And I'll just give you an example. Going into this last summer, when we thought there was going to be some heat challenges, we actually went out, similar to the stock market, where you can hedge, you can create call statements where you have the option to actually go procure from others. You work out a deal that way. So some of that is market, and then some of it is another sensitivity that we'll want to run. But it's a little bit different from an operational perspective than a planning perspective.
Depending on your answer, I may have another question. Where did the Snake River Dam just assume that they're not going to be decommissioned, or they are going to be?
We used E3 to help us generate a market price forecast.
Okay.
I would have to follow up with them to get to the specifics of what they assumed about Snake River. So I don't know that we called that out specifically. I could follow up on that, but I think in general, our market forecast assumed that the grid would remain reliable and that renewable standards would get met and that the grid would expand as needs expand. So I don't know whether that includes.
Well, that kind of leads to my next question where, I think the statistic is 40% of the electricity consumed in the state is from gas and coal. And if they're both going away, and how the state replaces that plus our increased demand, how did that factor into our supply?
I understand that is E3. That is one of the reasons that we did go to E3 and we calibrated our results to their results, because they take that into consideration. All of the coal that say they're going to go offline, the gas, and then they do have a methodology that the model replaces. And sorry, Frank wants to.
I was going to say, your first question is captured in the fact that we assumed Bonneville at the same rate. So we assume the block and slice are going to remain the same. So that is not accounted for if the size of Bonneville's system were to shrink because of the Snake River. They may still be obligated to supply us with the resource, but its makeup would probably be different. The issue about scarcity needs to be tested a bit more. Market prices is one of the sensitivities that would drive that, certainly, and that's something that we'll be testing. And the other one is just the scarcity on the transmission system, which we'll be testing. And then when you think about supply and demand, it may impact the peak cost of some of the resources that are selected. So we'll have to check that as well. So that's in the plan to test to see how, I'll say, like we had the climate change scenario. I think a scarcity scenario might be one that we look and say several of these components that go into the assumptions need to be checked in combination.
My last little, and just clarification on Seneca. Did you say that we're not, I'll get to the chase. Did you just assume we're not going to renew Seneca's contract and we're going to replace that load? I think it's 19 megawatts plus or minus. We're going to replace that with something else that's renewable. And is that the assumption that I heard indirectly?
I would say we did not take that issue head on. I was just saying, so
Tell me how that factors in here.
So we offered the model an affordable biomass facility. So it's like a prototype, let's say, and that was based on some very high level assumptions, and the model still didn't select it. And so I guess I would just say we did not model explicitly Seneca. We did not model explicitly IP. We just wanted to see what resources would be selected by the model and kind of pull out the thematic results.
So when we dive into this a little earlier, if we put, the Seneca is one thing, but what it does about redundancy during major earthquake event or anything else, if we put that as a priority as well, will that be able to be factored into our future iterations?
Yeah, I think that has to do with that'll come up a little bit when we look at the transmission.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's some other, so we can take certain resources like he did with Lieberg. The model didn't select Lieberg in 2036. Ben just unilaterally, put it in there, right? I mean, that's just what he did. We can look at certain resources. So the value of localness would be one thing. The other way is as part of an action plan, what would be our response from a redundancy perspective? And that may, hey, it has local value from an emergency perspective, and we could come up with options that might involve Seneca in that. So the model didn't select it based on its profile under this scenario, but that doesn't mean it might not select it, or the board and the utility might want to select it for a different reason. I would say the same about conservation. I think Ben mentioned that conservation was selected at about half the value of what it is today. There are other reasons we do conservation as well. One of them is a BPA obligation that we have, that they have from a regional perspective. So some of these weren't selected, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other reasons that we can make decisions around the portfolio.
I think one of the flexibilities of the particular program we're using is we can do things like that, Commissioner. We can take the portfolio and force something in and then see what the difference is in the cost, or see what the difference is in other aspects of the performance, and then you have something to measure.
When you say when we say the model didn't select it, we just mean it wasn't the lowest cost option that met all of our requirements, right? Thank you for the presentation and the memo, and I say this every time. I think it's so great to have this expertise and capability within the utility. I'm really grateful that we're investing in that, and thank you all for your work. And I don't think the Upper Snake River dams are big generators. For what it's worth, I don't think they're
So lower for. That's what I was referring.
okay. All right. Question about the reserves. Do the reserves cost us, or are we typically selling reserves at the last minute for the benefit of the utility?
This model assumes that if you have any excess generation beyond your load in any given hour, it just sells it to the market.
Okay, which is what we do effectively, right?
Yeah, we're a bit fancier than that. We do financial hedging and things like that. So there's a lot more, right? This is a little bit more simplified.
Not to downplay the importance of our trading floor. Understood. You said surplus energy can expose UM to the risk of falling energy prices. Would we expect that to be like a short-term duration in suppressed costs, or is that because we're looking out and overall we're seeing the price of new generation falling?
They're intertwined. I think that's a really great question, right? So there are some worldviews that if you build a massive amount of renewable generation that has zero dispatch cost, you could actually see falling market prices in the future. There's other worldviews that you may not be able to build as much renewable as you need and market prices might be high. So I think when we talk about doing our risk analysis, where we kind of look at different market prices and see how these portfolios perform with high market prices and low market prices, I think that gives us insight into we make build a portfolio of resources, how much risk is in that portfolio? So the software really lets us kind of play with that more. Market price volatility to kind of see the impacts, regardless of what causes it, that market volatility.
Right.
In some regards.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because that is why you test different sensitivities, is to understand the upside and the downside of the risk. And when EWEB built out significant resource in the early 2000s, phenomenal performance in our wholesale business until about 2010, when we saw prices plummet by about a third. So there was a price risk there. But you're right, it's a really good observation. The model is selecting based on peak, but then it has a whole year of energy that's produced by those same resources. And what do you do with those resources when you have some surplus and you recapture that in the market? And that's what the model's assuming.
Thanks. In terms of sensitivities, this particular calculation uses base case. Will we do a sensitivity to look at the electrification rates consistent with state and local electrification goals? That'd be.
Yeah, that was.
We can, I think we can. I think we could choose that. Our electrification study is what we used as our jumping off point, which is based on likely electrification based on economics.
Right.
So it doesn't mean we can't choose a
Right.
higher scenario to test.
Right, yeah, just mostly seeing the state aiming that way and federal dollars aiming that way. It seems like if we would be wise to have one scenario that's assuming we're meeting those targets, because it seems that's where we're headed. I'm curious to see the sensitivity on low water years. I'm also curious to see the sensitivity on unmanaged versus managed EV charging. It seems like that's a huge opportunity to keep prices down and build in a bunch of flexibility that we're not currently assuming. I know we've talked a little bit about conducting a local conservation assessment. Is that something that we have that will be queuing up?
I would say probably it's not part of an IRP process, but potentially a different process.
Okay.
This is going to tell us what conservation is worth and how much we can afford to invest in it. Something like that would tell us how much there is, whether those two things align. If it says go invest a lot, but you don't have the potential to invest locally because of whatever building stock you're dealing with, that's going to be a tough row to hoe. And we would probably have to adjust what we're putting into the model for the cost of that conservation, which would probably then go pick a different resource.
Mm-hmm.
So there's it's a separate piece that would be used as an input to this. I guess I'll say that.
That's the same for the demand response too.
Yeah, and the customer programs, testing the value of the customer programs is one of the purposes of the model. So how much is managing EV peaks worth to us? Right. If at some point it says it's not worth as much as going and getting another resource, but hey, it's worth this amount up to that point. So it allows us to then say, these are the investments that we should make, the incentives that we should create for peak shaving or load shifting or whatever other customer demand response programs or conservation programs we want. That's one of the real values of using a system like this.
Thanks. And then one more question.
Go ahead, and then I got John.
We have a goal around carbon-free power over time. I assume at some point here, there's an appropriate time for us to collectively weigh in, and President Brown was talking about it, just like the redundancy or the local resource, whether it's generation or storage or something. At what point do we have that conversation about what as a utility we'd like to see in terms of locally available resource?
I'd say, what I would say is, as we get to looking at what actions, what you might want to direct staff to do around, mid next year, as we put out the final IRP, that could be in some of our action items. If you have some, if you wanted us to provide you with information to help you have that discussion, that would be one way to do it.
I would say it's going to happen between now and June when we develop the action plan, we test the sensitivities, so that here is the value of a local resource, whether that be for economic reasons or whether that be for redundancy or resiliency reasons. The resiliency one is a little bit of it doesn't necessarily always relate to the specifics of your day-to-day load management. And I say that because let's say we could have a contract with Seneca that under emergency conditions, we get access to that power. We don't have to have access all the time. Who else are they going to sell it to under emergency? We could have that type of relationship, or we could have a relationship that was a little bit more load satisfying or, what should go into an IRP. So those, we can have those discussions really between now and June as we run sensitivities, get more public feedback, and then come up with an action plan.
Do you expect that would be an agenda item just squarely where we'd have a conversation about that particular?
Yeah, I think so.
John, you had a second round. Sonia, you had a second round. We're technically out of time, but unless I hear an objection, let's keep going.
Thank you. Hydrogen? Was there a scenario for hydrogen in anything going forward?
No, we did not assume a hypothetical gender.
Is that something that is in the model though, or sensitivity that can be put in? So they haven't even built it in yet.
So the software provider of Aurora has started looking at how to model hydrogen. And so that is emergent, but it is not currently in this reference case.
Something that's going to be helpful to me as a commissioner when dealing with constituents, being able to answer the question why solar is not on the table. I mean, it's in here, it doesn't pencil out. I understand that because I've sat in this room enough to understand all the complexities of solar. But I've got to be able to relate that to my constituents because they're hearing wind, solar, wind, solar, wind, solar. So is that something that a memo could be put together that could help me explain why we are not even looking at solar as an option?
And what we were thinking about doing is providing some tools next month. One could be a Q&A, or maybe even by January, we're going to have some neighborhood meetings in this town hall. One could be a Q&A. One can be just maybe a one-page summary of the IRP. We can do a lot of those kinds of tools, but a Q&A is definitely something I think we need. And I think that would meet your need.
I mean,
I think we can put some things in the report as well. The reality of it is that we didn't ignore it. The model didn't pick it. And the reason it didn't pick it is it has very little contribution to when we need peak. And yet over time, a very low capacity factor, basically. So you have to build a lot of it out to meet peak, which is expensive. And then you have low energy production relative to wind and the other alternatives. So that's why the model in essence didn't pick it.
so
We can explain that.
yeah, exactly. I mean, that's just something that it's like, oh, so wind and solar. So I guess the next thing would be our jobs in implementing this IRP. And at what point do you expect us, and what direction are you hoping to get from us? Are we going to say, I would like you to lean more into conservation, or I would like you to lean more into Seneca biomass? Where are those decisions, and when will you ask us those? Or, because I want to let you people that know how to do it know where to buy our power and stuff. I think it's more of us giving the community's values to this IRP is what I feel my job is. And I hope that that's right. And I guess so, if that's the case, that I'm trying to project the community's value into our IRP, what areas are appropriate for us to do that on?
So I would start with the direction that you could, the direction, the staff will come back, staff and management will come back, and we'll provide you with, maybe some recommendations to it, some action items maybe. And if we're doing a bunch of these sensitivities and we're seeing that there are some of these sensitivities that look like we may have a gap earlier or later, it doesn't matter. But you may want to have a conversation around what we can bring, what information we can bring to you to help you make some of those decisions on where you'd like us to look. Would you like us to look a little bit more into storage? Would you like us to provide you some information around wind? And then we could even go out and do an RFP at some point, or an RFI, and get more information and bring it back to you. So this is a process that we would work together on. And before we did any, before any type of a resource was purchased, we'd all do the analysis and the triple bottom line for you and provide you with that information.
I would add to that, Commissioner, that early on in this process, we really do want to engage the public a lot. And I think that the commissioners can help us get this out into the public to garner, if not necessarily support, but understanding of some of the components that go into this. And the other area that I think really the commissioners can help with is understanding that and guidance in the areas of risk, where, there's going to be financial risk trade-offs versus, you're always going to trade off, for example, do you want a stable low price, or do you want maybe a lower price, but it has a little more risk to it? Or, I think it's the values that you mentioned, bringing the values to the process, and then understanding that results in an action plan. And we want to make sure that all of you are comfortable with the action plan, knowing that that's going to iterate. In fact, I think investor-owned utilities are required to do an IRP every 2 years. Now, and we want to be able to iterate this a lot more. That's why we've brought in the talent that we have, so that we can make sure that we're not running off the rails. But I think your values comment was perfect.
Sonia, you had some questions? Go ahead.
Real quick, so on the solar, when you come back and talk about it, please make it relatable for the constituents if they start talking about model and getting into that. If we have like levelized costs or something where they can look at each of the costs and say, oh, well, this one's 10 versus 20, even if they don't understand the units, that would be, I think, more helpful to say, oh, well, geez, solar is like 50 times more expensive than this. Oh, now I get it. So that comment on there. I'm curious if you can value the options on Lieberg that we have without, us making the decision. I'd love to see what it would look like if we, did the partial return versus the, full return versus not doing anything, and how that changes the model even before we make the decision. Because
yeah, I think we have included an avoided cost model in the value of the Lieberg choices relative to generation or not generation. We'll include that with our recommendation.
On the biomass cost, plant cost assumptions, I am curious if there's been any discussion about actually talking with Seneca operators and saying, when you first put in a plant, you want to get all of the costs that you've put into it. I know the plant has a certain age of life, but it's probably still, quite a bit of it is still usable for some time. Maybe the costs, now that the original costs have been, already paid for, it might be a lot lower. I don't know, but it might be useful to, if you've already had,
Yeah, I think this speaks to the gap between the IRP process, which is kind of that philosophical strategic approach, and then going to all the way to like actually signing a deal on a procurement. I think the foundational nature of this IRP is we now know we have a need. I think that was one of my key takeaways is in 2026, we see a need. So now we know we actually are interested in new resources at some point. So I think that's the foundation that we can start to build on and start bringing in more data to this model. Like, what is the cost of a new wind farm? And what is the cost of a generator? And we could start adding more detail and getting more accurate so that we can really pick, least cost and best fit using these tools.
And Ben, specifically on Seneca, Commissioner Carlson, we did not put in the cost for Seneca that exists today.
I heard that. I mean, that was apparent in how you say it.
We put in,
very clear.
we put in a reference based on what we're hearing, those kinds of resources are costing across the region. So probably, I'll say it would be consistent with the market for that kind of resource.
That's still a new resource, right? That's not it's like we went and built a resource. There's an existing resource that's already there. Hey, could we contract with them? Also, a lot of the functionality of the building and the resources are already there.
Could you say like an affordable biomass facility might look a lot like a fully depreciated biomass facility? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, thank you for putting
Perhaps.
your words.
But you did it as a levelized cost of energy, didn't you?
Yeah,
So it's a little, I think her point is correct that there's going to be some nuance in there, but
Um, So if we don't hamper BPA growth, just out of curiosity, given that there is a requirement for them to help fill, I'm looking, I'm gonna throw this completely out there. I look across the bow at Springfield and I see their rates so much lower than ours. And I know that there are other factors to that, so don't get me wrong there, but they rely entirely on BPA. So how much of that, when they do have these peak situations, yeah, they pay through the nose, maybe, a few times a year, but maybe that doesn't entirely come out. And if they do have a big need from others, maybe it makes sense that they're the ones that are going out and finding the property and making a whole new kind of transmission. Do they only do the rivers, hydro and nuclear? Or do they have the option to do others if there was a need? I'm just saying, a larger entity of that nature going to have much bigger sway and resources to get those kind of resources than us as a small utility,
I'm curious if Bonneville, so when, in part of the conversation I was talking about with regard to renegotiating this next contract, there is discussion around what we're calling augmenting Bonneville, either going out with an RFP or somehow they augment it. They increase the system size and allocate that, and it kind of gets peanut buttered over everyone. That is being discussed right now as an option.
and it weighs into you're getting ahead of us just a little bit, because I think where you're going is what Megan and Rod and Deborah, if she was here, at some point, we have to take a look at the business model that we have, which is right now, we are a vertically integrated utility. We generate, we have transmission or buy it and we deliver to load. We need to evaluate whether that's the best business model going forward. And this would be one of the tools that would go into that, but it's certainly not the only one. And that's going to be something that will probably, I know we've talked a little bit about it. That's probably a late 2023, 2024 kind of timeframe to look at that.
And when we look at the Bonneville products that they have, and some of the costs of those, and we model them in this next 2024 IRP, that will feed into that as well.
Yeah, that's a really, I think that's probably, that's a significant piece of work for the utility, the board, because, Bonneville's looking at 15 to 20-year contracts. We more than likely can't be in the middle of a contract and easily make the kind of business adjustments that you're talking about. So there is a pretty important time frame between now and 2025 or so that we do a really in-depth analysis that you're talking about and have a really challenging and long-term impactful discussion at the board level.
Okay. Thank you. On the resiliency side, I know we've talked about, locality, valuing that. I think part of that touches in resiliency, but there may be other attributes of resiliency, the ability to black start, some of those kind of attributes. I don't know if that's capable to suss out in the model to some extent, but I'd be interested in that as well.
I would say it's typically done through qualitative analysis where boards typically have like scoring matrices that they kind of start considering these other things outside of just the modeling. So you can,
Triple bottom line, like they did.
similar to the triple bottom line analysis, you can kind of add criteria that the board wants to make decisions based on.
Okay, got it, but it won't be in this model. Okay, and then last, batteries. So we're talking about batteries, we're talking about using kind of a reverse where we're drawing on people's cars, or is there other battery kind of modeling that we have?
This is just based on the assumed cost of building a new utility scale battery. So utilities that build these large battery banks or site them next to wind farms, they publish their data to national organizations like the Energy Information Agency. And we use that data as a prototype for the typical cost of a utility scale battery. So we're not specific. So if you had a program that was EV backfeeding, that was around that same price and had the same attributes, you could say, oh, that's similar to what's in our model.
But we believe that, I mean, is it not true that you believe that the reason it's picking the wind and the battery together is how they work together, because you can store
Yeah.
when it over generates and the
Yes.
prices are negative.
Yes,
Yeah.
levels it out. Right. Okay, great. I continue to hear the thing about, well, we could draw on people's power and their cars. I don't want you to kill the battery life in my car. I mean, that's just, personal range perspective. But anyway, I've gone too long. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the time.
President Brown?
No.
I would add that some of the areas of storage we need to develop a little bit further. You mentioned hydrogen. Hydrogen would basically be modeled as some sort of generic form of storage. It would have a profile, it would have a life, it would have a capacity, it would have a cost. I have talked to E3 in the past, who was one of our consultants, about how we model hydrogen. And so we will have to, as things evolve and we understand that better, we'll take a look at it. I'm not sure about demand side charging. There are risks with that. I mean, even if it was chosen as an affordable option, I think there's consumer relationship pieces to that. And that would probably have to get modeled in the degree of participation that you would be able to get. So, Eugene was full of battery electric vehicles. There's only some percentage that would participate in that because of how that would work. So there's some evolution to the model that to take that into account.
Indeed.
Comment and a question. My comment is, I would just back to the idea about a conversation about local, resources. I would like to see some kind of conversation, maybe more than just a memo. I think it's something that we're grappling with here, and there's just a lot of pros and cons, and I would just like a little bit more information about that. And then my question is just like a bigger question. You're doing a lot of modeling. It's obviously a computer that's doing it and you're tweaking it. Historically, how good are we at modeling? Like when we did the last IRP, were we on target? Were we off?
I'm glad you asked that question, because that is, we have engaged, as Frank mentioned, E3. And E3 is very, this is their career. They're known, they're very reputable around about modeling. And what we engage them around is how they can teach us. And because we want to become experts in it. And so we've taken their models, we've calibrated it to ours. We've come close. This reference case comes very close. And so what our hope is that we know that I have a lot of confidence in the work that has been done now. We know that we're going to continue to have some challenge. You're going to be asking some questions, and we're going to need to tap into some other experts. Hey, how have you modeled that? What does it look like? Then you have to do your double checking and your validation. So I've had an incredible amount of confidence now, but it doesn't mean we're not going to have challenges as we move forward. Nobody has modeled the Bonneville products before. And so we're going to need time to do that. And it takes time. I think sometimes it takes a good, I think I'm trying to remember, what did Chris Robinson, he used to do it. He's the head of Tacoma City Light. And he said, you know what? It takes years for them to get really narrowed down on like the hydro system and how the hydro system works. So that's why we lean into some partners and we use some of their results and then we calibrate. That makes sense?
Commissioner Schlossberg, I would add that if you look back at our 2011 IRP and some of the iterations of that, we did a pretty good job of predicting the future with a lot less sophistication. I would say sometimes you can over sophisticate yourself into feeling a certain way. But because of the complexities that we see in the resources, the market, the consumption direction, this is necessary at this point going forward. The key to its accuracy is going to be how we treat assumptions, how we look at the boundaries of what we think we're testing for from a sensitivity perspective. And ultimately, we have to weigh in on some of the qualitative things that you all have talked about to be able to have a really logical, balanced approach going forward. And that, I don't want to say we're going to over rely on modeling. Modeling informs the decision-making process that we all have to go through. But historically, we've been pretty good at that. If you look back at how our conservation and energy efficiency programs and the contribution that they made, the one area that we really struggled with was when we saw a real depressed market occur and the impact that had on the utility in that 2010 to 2015 range, because we had to raise rates almost 70% during that time.
These models are incredibly more sophisticated. They were probability based back in 2011.
I think tonight you'll notice that we really emphasize that this is a reference point. And we want to change our assumptions and then compare it to this reference point. So I think as a modeling team, we're really trying to highlight uncertainty and then use that to, I guess, explore that together. And so that it can better inform the board to come up with strategies that we hope are more resilient to uncertainty. So I think that's one thing I think thematically we really try and emphasize. It's a lot of extra work. It's a lot of more back and forth conversations. So that's why we're coming back quite a bit. But we hope that it makes us more resilient when we make these hard long-term decisions.
I don't know if you thought he was joking or not, but John's Kreider said that when he pushes the button, it runs for 3 days. It runs for 3 days. I mean, I thought he was joking the first time I heard that, and I was like, oh, it really does run for.
Matt, do you have any closing questions? I don't either, so wrap up. What else does staff need anything else from us?
Great, thank you. Just know that we're here if you have more questions.
Well, pretty sure after tonight, we're gonna have more questions. So any closing comments, John?
Yeah, just for the commissioners, tomorrow morning at 7:30 at the Eugene Chamber of Commerce, we're doing a presentation on the Lieberg Canal to get some input from the local business community. So you're welcome to attend at 7:30 at the Chamber, 14th and Willamette. Doing a presentation and looking forward to it.
Anything else for the good of the order? I will adjourn the meeting.